Okay, y'all. Well, we'll dive in here this morning, and we got two more sessions here before Christmas break. Still in the High Middle Ages, kind of the 1000 to 300 period, a very fertile time in church history. Lots going on. We'll have some of the really dark stuff next week with some heresies. If Jimmy was still around, I would give him a hard time about Jimmy Frayne. Heresy starting in France, all these heresies in France, but he just left the building. So, but heresies and crusades next week. But this week, I'm going to talk about some other pieces that hang on, especially monasticism and university stuff. But we've said that this period really is, if you want just pure power politics for good or ill, and it was both, this is the time when the Western Church, later we'll call it the Roman Catholic Church, they didn't really use that term as much back then, but this is the time when the Western Christian Church is at the pinnacle of its secular power. And last week we talked about, even the Roman Catholic Church today walks back. We talked about them forbidding their priests now to run for public office in democracies and things. And so there is some pushback, but this is the pinnacle of power. We talked about in 1054 last week that schism between East and West really split things up in an odd way. So the East had 4 big guys calling the shots, and the West had 1 big guy calling the shots. And that pattern had repercussions all the way down, much more conciliar on the East. So they still get into snits with each other. We'll talk about that in January. The fact that we've got a Russian Orthodox congregation upstairs right now is because of some snits between the Patriarch of Moscow and the Patriarch of Constantinople, which happened recently, which was like, 3 years ago now, and probably is going to be decades to get sorted out, sadly. But 2 times from now, so that'll be January 16th, we'll deal with Orthodoxy.
Well, isn't that political and not really?
It's tied up with Ukraine, and yeah, we'll get to that later. We did talk last week too about the building boom in this time period, building churches, how high can you go, Gothic and Romanesque cathedrals, wonderful, beautiful architecture. I wanted to start with a different question today. While they were going high with their outside architecture, there was also a real push with monasticism to go deeper and deeper spiritually. So how high can you go was a big question in the Middle Ages, but let's get deeper was also a big push. And there were a lot of monasteries built during this time. There were certainly monasteries beforehand, but this would be a typical look for a medieval monastery. This is the simpler form. Here is a form of a real monastery, much more gigantic of a complex. We'll talk about this complex a little bit later. So some of these monasteries were big operations. This is just, the headquarters, let alone all the fields and other auxiliary, ancillary things that they are running. Just a quick review on monasticism. We talked about this November-ish. Monasticism started down in Egypt, moved up into what we would call Syria, Eastern Turkey, with Basil the Great. Eastern Orthodox monks and nuns still trace their lineage to Basil and his rule. The monastic movement then moved from Egypt west also, especially into France. It caught hold at first. The great Martin of Tours, the former soldier, was big in that. Also crossed the channel into England. It had a very Celtic flavor, and they were independent for a while, kind of cut off from Rome for a couple centuries. We talked about that. And also in Italy, it grabbed a hold. And in Italy, it took the peculiar form we talked about of Benedictine monasticism, which would eventually become the dominant form. It's kind of the default underlying monasticism in the West, and everything else kind of builds or branches or for the most part off of that, or reacts to it and says, we don't want to be like the Benedictines this way. It really is kind of the substrate or the basis for Western monasticism. So Rule of St. Benedict 516, we're talking about five centuries now later, half a millennium later. But during those 5 centuries and into the Middle Ages, into the 1000s, 2000, the 1000 and 1100 and 1200 period, there's a repetitive pattern, this constant cycle. Mad Magazine years ago had some cartoons, and it showed this lady baking pies in her little oven in her kitchen. And then it showed her selling pies to neighbors. And then she opened a very small store, Mom's Pies. And then the business keeps growing and shipping. And eventually you see this gigantic factory that says Momco, sending trucks of pies out. And meanwhile, there's a lady in the house next door selling pies at her house. So, this monasteries do the same thing. They start simple oftentimes. They build, they start to gain property and things. Also, sometimes their spiritual disciplines start to relax, and the reform movement comes in, sometimes internally, sometimes externally, and says, we need to reset here. And so we've got this pattern that happens a lot, both in the centuries leading up to this and during this time period as well. For example, some of these relaxation of disciplines were not a big deal, but so for example, Benedictine monks and nuns ideally have 7 services a day. You start at about 4 in the morning or so, then you have another service at 6, another service at 8 or 8:30. I'm using the calendar from the Benedictines I'm familiar with in Michigan.
Sometimes they're even midnight, 3, 6.
In the old days, they
9.
did, yeah, thank you. And in the old days, clocks were actually, timekeeping was actually invented by monks because nobody else cared about hours. And they would have, water clocks and candles that would burn down. And some monk would have to stay up and watch, and then wake everybody else up. Hey guys, church time, that kind of thing. But one of the examples of when a monastery starts to go soft spiritually is that there were a number of monasteries that said, okay, do we really want to have to get up in the middle of the night and come to church? Why don't we do our last service of the day, Compline, and then why don't we do our first service of the day right after that? Let's get the midnight or 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. service out of the way at 8 p.m. the night before. And so you can see, so things like that start to creep in, and we want to be able to sleep, and we want to be monks, but not that much. Let's make so. And then some group comes along and says, no, you gotta get up in the middle of the night to do your services. And okay, so that pattern kind of repeats itself over and over again.
Well, Jim,
Yes,
you came
Abby.
up with the rule that at monasteries that you have to get up at 3 in the morning to pray. I mean, who says there has to be 7 services?
That was part of the rule of Saint Benedict, to say you need to, it comes from a psalm, 7 times a day shall I praise thee. And so he pulls out of that, and local monasteries would then adapt that and say, okay, these are the times we're going to do these prayers. And so one monastery might be 4 in the morning, one might be midnight, as Jimmy said. They adapt that rule locally, but that's kind of the Benedictine ethos. Some newer monastic groups might only have 2 or 3 services a day that they get together for. That's not uncommon, a morning service, an evening service, and maybe a noon service or something. But the really strict Benedictines try to do the 7 services. The monks I'm familiar with in Michigan, I hang out with the most, on Sunday, they combine the first 2 services and wake up at 5:30 instead of 4 in the morning. So they combine the 4 and the 6 o'clock service at 5:30 on Sundays to sleep in. Other than that, though, and on big feast days like Christmas, they get to sleep in an extra hour and a half. So, so that's their local adaptation to the rule of Saint Benedict. And that's still very adaptable. Good question. Well, right before our period, one of the big monastic reforms right before the 1000 to 1300 period is the Cliniac Reform in a place called Clooney in France. In fact, I showed a picture of a group of monks I visited once in Wagner, Oklahoma, that came from France. They actually are a descendant of Cliniac via Solesmes, and there's a chain that they've gone through their mother houses, but they are Cliniac monks at heart, and they're very hardcore in their observance of Benedictine stuff. So Cliniac Reform. What happened in Clooney is that not only did they make these reforms, they started spreading them out to other monastic houses that they planted. And they also, this is one of the first groups that really kind of set themselves up as being under the Pope and being autonomous from the local jurisdiction of bishops. So we're not going to answer to Bishop Scott in Lubbock. We'll answer to the head guy. Our head guy is based in New York / Washington, D.C. Our presiding bishop is Michael Curry. So we're going to answer the top guy, and we're not going to answer the local yokel anymore. And so that kind of gave them some interesting power. They were kind of a parachurch organization in some ways. They weren't in the strict hierarchy of things. They were differently plugged into the thing. And so they also kept some control over all those daughter houses they put out there. So over the years, again, Clooney got very powerful. The Abbot of Clooney, because he sat at the top of this structural pyramid, actually got a fair amount of power. That wasn't the intent, but it was one of those, things get corrupted, things get, you don't intend to do that, but that was one of the outgrowths of that. So he was in charge of all these Cluniac monasteries, and this is significant, boom, there's the map. By the time we get to our period, that's a significant number of houses that the Abbot of Clooney has some influence over. No bishop in the church at this point, except for the Bishop of Rome or the patriarchs out in the Eastern Orthodox Church, have this kind of power. This abbot became very powerful, overseeing. Now, they didn't have telegraphs or phones or internet or anything, so communication is slow. You're not wielding direct power day to day, but that's still a lot of oversight that you have. All right, another group besides the Cluniacs. In 1098, so a couple centuries after the Cliniac Reform, there's a group within the Cluniacs that thought the Cluniacs had gotten off the track. And so they founded a group called the Cistercians. And the famous Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, not the Saint Bernard that the dog is named after, but a different Saint Bernard. That guy was actually a contemporary of Saint Bernard Clairvaux. But anyway, more or less, they were close. He said he was a real spiritual leader. He also was instrumental in preaching the crusade, the first crusade, but we'll get to that later. But Bernard of Clairvaux was kind of the spiritual force behind, we got to get back on track. And so the Cistercians became a pretty big group during this time period as well. Just for the map, there's a Cistercian map from your book. They had quite a few monasteries that they would plant. And if you notice, there's a kind of a cluster of blue dots in central France there. That's where the Cistercians kind of started, and then they branched out. Yeah, Trey.
Where did the name come from, Cistercians? I hear it and I think sister.
Citeaux in France. The monastery of Citeaux was the heart of that movement. So just a geographical appellation. All right. The Cistercians also, they unintended consequences. Cistercians decided, we need to get away from the population centers. Let's go out to the nastiest swamps and fenlands and moors and mountainous places where people aren't living, so we can really get away from it all. Ironically, they got very creative. They were smart monks, and they said, well, if we've got this cruddy land, can we improve it? Can we do some things to make it better? And they improved the land so much that it drew people to move out to those areas, and also gave them quite a bit of wealth, because rising tide lifts all boats. And so ironically, they tried to get away from it all and ended up making the wilderness areas fertile and blooming and productive. So again, you try to do one thing, and over time, things shift. All right, and this points to a problem that we have all the way through. Monks, ideally, try to forsake things like property. And as individuals, they give up their property and enter the monastery, and the monastery gets whatever clothes off their back or what little property. They have some money in their pocket. That's donated to the monastery when they become monks. But as you're improving land, as you become a landlord, landholder, you have peasants out there working your fields, because you get big enough, you don't have to have the monks doing it anymore. You can hire people to do that, and maybe hire some auxiliary staff to do some. Things grow, lands grow, holdings grow. And so that's going to be a continuing problem with monasticism. You start out poor, but your successors, and you don't have any kids to give the property to, it stays with the monastery, stays with the group. And so they start to amass property, land, wealth. over the years. And so there's this constant pushback. And then maybe some reform group will come along and say, we need to change that. Maybe some outside group will come in, Protestant Reformation. They said, we got way too many wealthy monasteries here. Let's take advantage of that. Your land is now the king's. Great. That happened in the Reformation in England. Henry VIII seized a lot of monasteries. Threw a lot of monks out and nuns out on the street. Same thing happened in the French Revolution. There was a real pushback. That stayed a Roman Catholic area for the most part until the Revolution. And French Revolution, they seized monasteries and guillotined a lot of monks and abbots and things, nuns and things like that. So part of the Reign of Terror. And so just again, this actually is a picture of Clooney. And this is, we talked about the Cliniac Reform. This is Clooney 3, as they call it, the third iteration of the Clooney Monastery. So like I said, things got pretty major there. They actually have some smaller churches, and then they got this gigantic church that they grew into in their third stage. And so this is a perennial problem with monasticism in Europe during this time.
So Jim, the churches they built, was it just for the monks or for the people surrounding?
Yeah, usually it'd be just for the monks, but they usually would have a guest pew or 3 or 7. Well, not really pews because people would stand in those days. An area for guests to come.
So where did the peasants go to church?
The peasants might go to their local village church if they had one. But you know, if you're working for this group, if you're the peasant working the land there, you might just come to the monastery chapel for your services. Why not? And remember, back in this time too, we'll talk about this later on. Worship was something you attended more than did. It got less and less participatory. Roman Catholic Church, even though Mass was what happened every day, and it was the big service every week, very few people received communion on a regular basis. You received communion rarely, even that you watched communion. The high point of the service was seeing the body and blood of Christ held up. I've shared the story before, but back in that day, you celebrated facing the altar with your back to the congregation, and there'd be a point where the priest would hold up the bread and wine, and that was the big pinnacle for a lot of people, just to see the body and blood of Christ, Jesus's presence in the communion.
So only priests participated in it, the Eucharist.
Just for about probably the other ministers and the altar server, of course.
You have a server, and some people may want to, there undoubtedly there were some devout little old ladies that would, make sure that they got communion every time they could. But by and large, the populace did not receive that often. Big feast days, Christmas, Easter. In fact, there's a rule today to be a good Roman Catholic, you got to receive between Easter and Pentecost. You got to have communion during that 50-day window. One communion. You don't have to be there every week. Yeah, Abby.
I'm looking at how large this monastery
Yeah.
is. It's figuring, how many people live in that?
I'm not sure. I'm sure we're in the thousands of monks. That's a big operation there. And this is the head of that Cluniac order that's spread all over the map. So, Jimmy.
And a lot of those monks would want to go to that one specifically to be part of that monastery. And they'd all have to fit into that one church for most of the services.
Yeah, and so you want to have the church would have to be big enough to hold the entire community, and which is why you got the smaller version of the church.
A couple of the priests can do their masses.
You got a small church here, but then it grows into the big church over here on their property. Yeah, you have all these side altars because every priest had to celebrate Eucharist every day. If you ever go to Washington, D.C., National Cathedral is ours on one hill, but you climb up in the tower there, you look to far the other side of Washington, there's the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, the big Roman Catholic Church. And they have got, not a bazillion, but they've got dozens of little side altars back, a remnant of every priest had to say communion or have a communion service every day. Sometimes just be a priest and one server, because you had to have somebody to do it with you. But all these little side altars scattered around that church. So same thing would have been present here. All right. During this time, so another reform movement, and this was a group that decided we're going to be different. Every group so far we've seen, we had those hermits that lived off in the desert, and there were hermits during this time that lived off in the woods and things, but things were basically monastery based. In the 1200s, there were two movements that really tried to push back on this in a new way. They decided to call themselves Mendicants, which meant beggars. They weren't going to live in a monastery. They were just going to let the people supply their needs. They put a bowl out and beg, and they preach and teach and do things in the community, but they weren't going to have a monastery. In fact, a lot of Buddhist monks still function that way. They have begging bowls that they take with them and set them out, and the people take care of them.
Where did they live? But did they have houses they lived in?
But today or back then? Back then, they just lived in
So they were homeless.
basically homeless.
Yeah.
In some way, yeah.
And that's why, well, I
But
don't like.
let's hold that thought. Jimmy is part of a mendicant order, so we'll. The two big mendicant orders during this time were the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Two very different orders. Two orders that have a healthy rivalry. It's funny. There would be Franciscan theologians, but the Dominicans say our theologians are better, and the Franciscans say, "Oh no, you need to listen to Saint Bonaventure, not Saint Dominic or Saint Thomas Aquinas." So a healthy rivalry between these two because they are similar in many ways. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and Jimmy is a Franciscan. If he were a Benedictine, he'd be a third order person, a lay person that is auxiliary to the folks that take monastic vows to live in a monastery. Benedictines have kind of a three-part structure. The first order is the monks that live in the monastery and take lifelong vows of celibacy, all that. The second group is a group that's uses that kind of same heavy rule of life. And eventually they could, if they wanted to, move into the monastery, but they still kind of live out in the world. Then the third order is more, we're not going to live in monasteries, we're going to be out in the world and be lay people. And we can be married if we're lay people. So the Franciscans don't use that Benedictine first, second, and third order, but if they did, Jimmy would be a third order Franciscan, just to keep things confusing. So let's talk about Franciscans here. So Francis of Assisi, probably the most admired saint and least imitated saint, paradoxically. Nobody wants to live like Francis because he did live basically almost homeless. He lived right at the turn of the century between the 11 and 1200s, died in his 40s. Very wealthy upbringing. His dad was a very wealthy cloth merchant. Jimmy has shared the story, I didn't know, that Francis was not a given name that anybody in Europe had up until St. Francis. It was his nickname, Frenchy, basically, because his dad did some trade with the French. And so they called Francis Frenchy as a nickname, and it stuck. And because St. Francis was so popular, it took off as a popular first name in Europe after his death. So he was a knight. He was taken prisoner at some points. Eventually, though, he lived a wild life, as a lot of people did. I mean, Francis is the Buddha. The Buddha lived a wild. You get these figures that live a wild life, then forsake that to have a different kind of life. Francis follows that. He eventually forsook his inheritance, and his dad kept trying to haul him back and haul him in and lock him up till he came to his senses and all that. And very famously of Francis, Dad said, basically, come back home. You're not going to inherit anything from me if you keep doing this dumb stuff. And this is public. And Francis stripped naked in the town square or in the church.
In the town square.
In the town square. So he strips naked and says, Dad, all your stuff, it's yours again. And symbolically, the bishop took off his cloak and clothed Francis because he was naked standing in the town square. But the church kind of taking Francis in, Francis forsakes his worldly property and takes on religious stuff. So at first he wasn't trying to start a big movement, but he did have some people that were attracted to him. They called themselves friars instead of monks. Frère, French brother. And also Francis wanted to make sure there were some other kooky movements. We'll talk about those kooky movements next week that were rising up in France and Italy at this time. Francis did not want to be associated with those. And so somehow he got the Pope to give his blessing to this mendicant order of friars, which, it's kind of kooky to forsake property and live basically homeless and things like that and beg for your stuff. And so he was very wise and astute in some ways in getting papal approval. Didn't hurt that Assisi is not that far from Rome, a couple days walk, a couple hours drive these days. So Francis started a movement, the Franciscans. He died in 1226, and he was fast-tracked for sainthood 2 years after his death. So not many people become saints that quickly. Thomas of Becket in England did, Francis did. Usually it takes a couple decades or more, centuries in some cases. But
To like investigate miracles done through them.
these days, there's a elaborate, Francis, I mean, there's so much miraculous stuff that accreted around him, and probably a lot of it could be legendary, but he certainly had a wide reputation. He made a treaty between the wolf of Gubbio and the town, and, because he could communicate with the wolf. And anyway, lots of, Dr. Doodle in some ways. But also, Francis famously received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ somehow, mystically. So that's part of the Franciscan lore as well, shared in the suffering of Christ in that way. Interestingly, though, things change, and within 80 years or so, the Franciscan movement had gone from being purely mendicant, homeless, out in the streets, living with the poor, they started getting monasteries themselves. In fact, and some of them were donated by other groups. Oh, we don't need this monastery. Do you guys want to move in over here? And 1300, the map is astounding. So this group that's not going to have any property, not going to be monastically oriented, boom, there are Franciscan houses 80 years after Francis's death. So, these things, it is a very popular movement. And, again, you want to have someplace to lay your head. It's hard to be purely mendicant like St. Francis. Again, that's part of, nobody wants to imitate Francis. They want to admire him, but nobody wants to live that extreme an example of Jesus's life. Yeah.
The only thing is, with the monasteries, you would usually only be at the one monastery for your entire rest of your life. But the Franciscans, I think, would move around between the houses a lot more.
Interesting. So they used them as bases to still go out and do their preaching and teaching mission.
So in kind of the home base for their stuff.
And preaching to the poor and teaching the folks, that was important. And Franciscans and Dominicans, that was a huge thing that they did. So that's an interesting. Thank you, Jimmy. That's very helpful detail. Anything else you want to share about Francis before I move on to Dominic?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Jimmy knows more about Francis than I do, so I'd hope so. He's a Franciscan. So I would probably become a Benedictine if I was going to be anything. So, okay, Dominicans. St. Dominic lived about the same time as St. Francis. They overlap pretty much. He was a Spaniard. His uncle was an archbishop, and parents, there were some problems, and so Dominic was raised by his uncle, the archbishop, a lot of his life, and sure enough, he was tracked to be a priest. And Francis never became a priest. Francis took diaconal orders, but he thought being a priest he didn't want to have that kind of status or in the culture. And so he lived as a deacon. He wanted to be a servant, interestingly. But Dominic was a priest. 1215, Dominic, so not long before, only 6 years before his death. So he's, what at that point, 45. He founds this group. He decides that in southern France, Toulouse, France, he wants to try to do this urban preaching mission and live with the folks, the poor in a city. And so Dominic, whereas Francis is kind of out on the road more, Dominic is in the ghetto, basically. They still have the house. You can still see a picture of the house in Toulouse. It's still there, that first Dominican house. They've preserved it. And so he starts this, he and 6 other guys, so the 7 of them are in this house to help care for the spiritual needs of this population of urban poor. And he also was very astute. He did the same thing Francis did. He got the Pope's approval, which, because there are kooks running around southern France at this time. And so I doubt Dominic and Francis probably never even met, but they both had the same playbook as far as we need to get. They were very astute in getting papal approval. And they made a joke of their name. His name was Dominic, which is why they're called Dominicans, but Dominicanus means God's dogs, the dogs of God. And so they joked that they were God's watchdogs or God's guard dogs or whatever out in the world to help do things. The Dominicans were actually very useful in trying to combat some of those kooky things that were floating around. We'll talk next week about those. Some of those movements lasted for centuries, had real foothold in some poor areas of France and southern Italy and things. But the Dominican preachers were one of the groups that the Pope actually deployed and said, can y'all really help us try to combat these strange ideas of the Cathars? All right, different. If you notice, Dominic has a different kind of robe on, kind of a cloak. That's an El Greco painting, Spanish painting there, over a white robe. And so you sometimes see different monks and nuns. There's some cartoons I got. It's a little hard to tell here, but the Franciscan habit is either gray or brown, and it can be all kinds of different shades of brown. Jimmy's is kind of a chocolate brown, but it can be a dark brown or it can be a gray. But the others are all black or black and white. So we talked about Benedictines. They're just pure black. They were the first group that was big in Europe. Cistercians, that reform of the Cliniacs, they wear white with kind of a black scapular over it. The Dominicans wear white, but they put kind of a cloak, a two-part cloak over it. So they look a little different. The Franciscans, stand up, Jimmy. I mean,
Yeah.
Jimmy didn't come dressed because he was going to see this picture here. He doesn't have a rosary on his left side of his belt like a Catholic Franciscan might, but he got the knotted robe. And so these different groups, and there are a bunch of other orders. These are just the bigger ones. There are all kinds of smaller orders out there with different kinds of habits.
Do the robes symbolize anything? Or
What's with the knots? Three
Okay,
knots.
so the rope really was just Jesus says so Francis heard in the gospel that Jesus said not to wear a belt or anything, so he literally just grabbed a rope and tied it around his waist instead. And the three knots are the three vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. And in my community, it's humility, fidelity, and simplicity. But they originally were just practical, but now they take on the vows that Franciscans have.
You know, I wear a robe with my vestments, and I remember we had a parishioner who was half Native American, and her dad was a medicine man and came, and he wanted to know the symbolism of why I tied the rope that way, and I said to keep it up, you know. That's the reason the knot is functional. It's not symbolic. Oh, okay. He wanted to know all the deep meaning of that, but. The Trinitarian, yes, son.
One Dominican note, actually the priests at St. Elizabeth's are all Dominicans. And they're always Dominicans at that church.
At that particular parish.
Yeah.
And that's something, that's a good point. Sometimes there are groups, the Jesuits will be much later, but oftentimes you'll have a parish that's staffed by Jesuits. They will kind of deploy guys from the same group because you don't want Franciscans and Benedictines together because rivalry and you don't want Aggies and Texas Tech people together in large groups too much because friction happens. So you have the Aggie church anyway. So any questions about monasticism before I switch over here? Okay, let's talk just a bit about schools and universities. Certainly the Mendicant orders were teachers. That was something they stressed. Certainly there were other monasteries that did some teaching, especially the monks that they would bring in. Part of the Benedictine order is prayer and labor, but the prayer in some houses would also involve study. Not every monk was cut out for it, but if you could teach a monk to read, they would learn to read. They did a lot of the copying of manuscripts, making, every book had to be written by hand. And so monks would often be doing that back in the day. So you have to have some level of education to be literate enough to write. Not every monk was, some monks would have to, would work in the blacksmith shop or out in the fields, but other monks would work in the scriptorium and depending on their abilities and how big the monastery complex was. So that was happening in monasteries, but also at this time, cathedrals starting having schools on the side where students would come to learn some things. And universities also started bubbling up during this time. The roots of universities, there's actually great argument about which university was the first real university. And there's no definitive historical answer. It's hard to document exactly a date for each university, but some of the bigger ones were in Paris, Bologna in Italy, Oxford and Cambridge in England. Salamanca was a big university in Spain. Those were amongst the first real wave here. Hard to see the colors here, but there are, in your book, there is a graph of universities all the orange are founded before 1300, Oxford, Cambridge, Salamanca, and others scattered around. And then there's brown, 1300 to 1500, quite a few of those. St. Andrews had a friend who studied at St. Andrews to get his doctorate in New Testament. And then the green is after 1500, and even more universities. Germany's kind of a little bit later. You see Italy and France and England in the orange. Germany's more brown and green, but eventually in Czechoslovakia and, well, what's it called now? Czech Republic, thank you. Map keeps shifting here. But things start to bubble up all over Europe here. Now, universities are not quite like Texas Tech here. The book gives some good descriptions. At most, a large university have a couple of 3,000 students, maybe 5,000 at the very, very outside. They weren't highly organized. You did not have the structure, did not have a finance office, bursar, so, all the things like that we have. But what universities did have, they had an emphasis on the classic Greco-Roman curriculum. They talked about the trivium and the quadrivium, the 3 and the 4 areas classically. And so the medieval universities pushed that classical pattern. So the 3 were grammar and logic and rhetoric, how to make good arguments. Interesting. So the first thing you want to learn is grammar. We still talk about grammar schools. This is kind of a basic level. The holdout from that. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. I had a guy, he was a priest by that time, but he would come to the seminary and do classes. His wife later became a professor at a seminary of the Southwest. But Mike was doing projects in studying medieval rhetoric. And he would tell you more than you ever wanted to know about. He's a brilliant man, but he knew medieval rhetoric and all the theories of that. Anyway, grammar, logic, rhetoric. And then the 4, after that, you would study arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And people like Dr. Hollins would always be glad to know music was part of the basic curriculum. And then if you wanted to get more advanced than that, often medicine, law, and theology would be the big advanced areas that you might be able to get a doctorate in, or a master's degree or something higher up. And when you go see a graduation at Tech, they always have all the colors of the hoods. I always like to point out that the older you are, the more basic your color is. And so a little hard to read here, but humanities, arts, letters, they have the white hoods. Sciences have the golden yellow. You got philosophy is the dark blue. Medicine is a nice solid green. Law is a nice solid purple. And theology, we've got a very basic color of red. Texas Tech red, in fact. So my hood has Texas Tech red on, not because I went to Tech, but because it was a theology degree. And so later on, other disciplines that would arise in universities have to try to find other colors, and you get more of the pastels and the different rainbow of colors. But the most basic areas have the most basic colors, and they kind of grow out from that. So, all right.
Jim,
Yes.
I'm assuming that at this point in the history of the world, there were no other universities anywhere in the world like Asia, Africa, anywhere else. This is the beginning of universities in the world.
That's a good question. I know Spain. Spain is under Islamic control at this point too, and they have universities though in that way. They had schools, but yeah, whether they would be universities
like this.
Yeah.
Probably not,
I think
Gordon.
the professorial, somebody would teach, but I don't think.
You have teachers, but not the same kind of structure. Not that a lot of people would be clumped together in a close area.
So nothing was going on in China that even resembled anywhere close.
Well, China, you don't want to, you want to train just a select group, and it's a select group in Europe too, no doubt, folks are here. But China, the imperial control and all that, it's much more rigid.
Okay.
Free exchange of ideas and Chinese imperial culture do not go together.
But like in the Islamic world, though, they were great at the sciences.
They were great at the sciences. They preserved Aristotle. It was in this time that we'll talk next week about Aquinas, that Aristotle was rediscovered. The Arabs held on to Aristotle and brought it back into Europe. Aristotle was gone from European consciousness until the Arab manuscripts got translated into Latin then, and oh yeah, well, we got this Greek guy translated to Arabic, now coming back into Latin. The weird thing, you kind of tipped your professor at the end of your lecture. You paid every lecture. And so, it was just part of the, again, no finance office, no bursar, no faculty salaries and all of that, paid by lecture. And so as you might imagine, professors that were a little more popular or maybe lean towards entertaining the students or whatever might get bigger tuition fees and things. So that was a part of the system. A lot of it was done by recitation. The professor might have a book and read you the book because their books were a very scarce resource. And writing notes was even hard because parchment and paper were expensive commodities. You might be able to do some of that, but not a lot. And so a lot of it was rote memorization. That's something we don't do very well. We write things down so we don't have to remember them. But they had to lock it into their brains in a very different way. So let's talk real quick. The big A's of theology at this point. Aquinas and his teacher Albert, they both studied Aristotle, who was rediscovered during this time, brought from the Arabs. Anselm and Atonement and Abelard are kind of three of the big guys during this time period. So let's talk about Aquinas. Second really only to St. Augustine as far as, well, St. Paul is first for Christian theology, then Augustine of Hippo, and then St. Thomas Aquinas. Even today, philosophy is all about whether you kind of agree with Aquinas or disagree with Aquinas. And, that was part of the history of philosophy after that. Aquinas actually was kind of a big kid and kind of slow. And so he was nicknamed the dumb ox as a kid and turned out to be just this brilliant thinker as he grew up. So it's an ironic nickname. He really dived into Aristotle, which was the hot new rediscovery at that time. And he was very careful about saying this stuff's good and this stuff's not. We can glom onto this as Christians, and this part of Aristotle over here, we need to leave that by the wayside because that's not congruent with the gospel. His big book was Summa Theologica, the summary of theology. I mean, just this massive tome. And like I said, later philosophies about whether or not you agree with Aquinas. Another big guy, a little bit earlier than Aquinas, is Anselm, one of the archbishops of Canterbury. His famous book is Why God Became Man. And what we remember Anselm for is his theory of atonement. Real quick, atonement is about the meaning of the crucifixion and why Jesus died on the cross. Up until this time, the idea was ransom theology of atonement, that the devil's in charge of the world, and somehow God had to pay some sort of ransom by giving his son to the devil. And there's also some trick involved with some of the ransom theology. The devil got to kill Christ, but thought he'd stay dead. And aha, surprise, he's not dead anymore. Ha, 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 ha. So that's ransom theology. If you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that is classical. C.S. Lewis loved old stuff. That's classic ransom theology, Aslan's death. The White Witch has Aslan under his power because he's taking the place of the kid, and he belongs to the witch, and he gives his life for the other guy. All right, that does morph. Well, later on, there's an expression of ransom called Christus Victor in the 20th century, Christ the Victor. That it's not just defeating the devil or tricking the devil. It's about cosmically conquering death. That's a big atonement movement in the 20th century. But in between, Anselm formulated what we call satisfaction or penal substitutionary atonement. Calvin actually coined the term penal substitutionary, but it really is a Anselmian satisfaction theology. This is something that you still hear. This is very much popular with evangelical Christians today. I went to Abelard quickly. So real quick, that God is a holy God. God in his infinite justice cannot abide the transgressions that we have, and so the penalty has to be paid, and so he substitutes in his son. The son pays the penalty for us that we cannot. And so that's still very much part of our Christian mindset in a lot of places. Abelard Abelard, not a saint, he had an affair with a pupil named Heloise. They had a famous correspondence. Her uncle got Abelard castrated involuntarily. One night, some thugs waylaid him and did it. So he and Heloise both went into monasteries and nunneries, and they still carried on a correspondence. So their love affair went on from a distance, even though they couldn't be sexual anymore. They did have a kid together before he got castrated. But as a monk later, that's why Abelard's not a saint. But later, Abelard wrote "Sic and Non," yes and no, and talked about faith and reason. But Abelard also pushed back on ransom and satisfaction atonement, and this is something that's still in the Christian church too. He said, "No, Jesus died to be a moral influence or an example to us of how to live a sacrificial life." So the moral exemplar theory came out in this time as well. So of kind of the four atonement theologies, two of them are right at this time with Abelard and Anselm. So you have these, and I would say real quick, the mystery of the cross is so broad that there are aspects of all four of these that should be retained here. I actually have a little bit of a piece on medieval theology, on Mary, on the Eucharist, saints and relics. I'm going to actually front load that next time, because I'd like to spend just 5 minutes on it, and we're kind of, or 7 minutes or 9 minutes, and so we will flick those slides over to the next piece next time and talk about some of that medieval theology before we talk about crusades and heretics. So, yeah, Mark.
Any idea why atonement became a big question during this period?
Well, I think they were some of the silliness of, if you push ransom theology to its furthest extent, is Satan really in charge of things? Does God really give Satan that much power over the world? Or are we giving Satan too big of a place here? And so that's part of the pushback from Abelard or from Anselm, and then from Abelard as well, who's also pushing back on Anselm. But so that, I think that's probably the major reason that in the ransom theology, the part of Satan is probably too prominent. It's not that Satan was in charge of things; God's always in charge of things. Anselm would say, and Abelard would probably agree. Yeah, Abby.
Okay, at the very beginning today, you showed us a slide that said monasteries not only were growing taller, they were going deeper, and then you didn't follow up on that.
Well, we talked about churches going taller and monasteries trying to go deep spiritually, and so there was spiritually
okay.
deeper. Thank
I
you.
just have to clarify that.
No, thank you. Yeah, that was part of, and as you're, there weren't a lot of avenues for great, lay people having heavy prayer lives was not something that was emphasized, but if you wanted to do that, a monastery gave you an opportunity to do that. We would say in the church today, everybody should have a prayer life, and not just show up in church and watch services, but participate and read the Bible at home. That's part of our Protestantism. Read the Bible yourself and pray yourself, in addition to coming to public worship. But that's a Reformation push in some ways. But monasteries were an outlet for that kind of thing. Yeah, Gordon.
Who built all these structures? Did the monks and friars self-perform, or did they hire people? Or
Yes, but I mean, the more complex you got, some of the simpler ones. I mean, Francis actually repaired a church by himself pretty much and had a couple of helpers. There was a church in ruins, and he had a vision. He heard Francesco rebuild my church, and he thought it meant rebuild this little chapel in ruins. Later on, people would say it was a call to rebuild the church, not just this little building. But yeah, it depended on the size. And there were certainly architects out there that stonemasons and things, that the bigger structures, they would hire that. I did 6 weeks in Panama, in seminary, kind of a missionary type trip, not to convert them, but just kind of learn from them. And I was with one group of Episcopalians, and on Sunday afternoon, every week, they were in a small building, and they got out there with the cement and the cinder blocks, and they were working on their bigger building. They weren't hiring any contractors. It was the congregation out there putting the cinder blocks together a little bit at a time, 1 week at a time. So some of the monks, smaller buildings certainly could have done that and did. Good question. Okay, y'all, we'll start with some medieval theology of Mary and transubstantiation stuff next time, and then we'll go crusading after that. Deacon Les today, Becky was sick, I had the crutch, the non-COVID crutch, she's doing better than. Correct, we got a new family that transferred in, from Corpus Christi, and the oldest son, who's 15-ish, acolyted down there, so.
Cool.